Welcome back to PCTR's Generous Justice Study. I'm so glad that you have come back. And I know the first couple of weeks were jam-packed. And at the same time, I hope they were eye-opening, challenging, and maybe even encouraging as you've gotten to know God more. Maybe you've gotten to know God as the God who is just, not only just in his punishment, but just as he stands with, identifies with, the poor and the outcast and the vulnerable. You probably were already convinced before this study that the world is not a just place. But maybe through the course of these first weeks and first chapters of this book, you've also seen how our own society isn't just, especially when we think about justice as pursuing and seeking the good and the well-being of the outsider, of the other, of those who are vulnerable and on the margin, vulnerable to the individual forces and structural forces that would keep them from the thriving life that God intends for them. And maybe you're also becoming convinced of the calling to do justice, that this is part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and one who loves God is one who loves our neighbor by doing justice. But maybe you're wondering, well, what really is going to keep motivating us? What's going to sustain us in the long haul, especially when we look at how complicated doing justice is? That's really the subject of chapter 5. Why should we do justice? I appreciate how Keller directly addresses some of the ways that we compel one another to do justice. He talks about how we use, of course, good old-fashioned guilt. Right, this was the approach that many of our parents took when they were trying to get us to eat vegetables growing up. You know, there are starving children somewhere, and they would love your vegetables, so you shouldn't just eat them, you should be thankful and eat them. How well did that work to convince you? Not so well then. It doesn't actually work all that well in the long run for motivating justice either. And yet, many have experienced churches and pastors and others trying to use guilt to sustain or to motivate doing justice. Yet Keller rightly acknowledges that these appeals to moral obligation they didn't actually have any lasting power then, and they certainly don't hold in today's climate. Instead, we appeal to other things like practical reason to try to motivate people to do justice. For example, we try to convince each other to do something for those who are suffering in poverty based on the reality that those who are suffering that way are a significant financial burden on society. And so we try to convince each other it's best for them, but it's also best for the greater good. Or when practical reason breaks down, we might appeal to simple sentimental love. You can think about all of the examples you've seen where these pictures are flashed across a screen of a poor child or someone suffering in terrible circumstances, and the sad music playing to tug on the heartstrings and our compassion so that we'll be moved to do something and to have mercy on those poor people. Yet the reality is all of these motivations can have short-term impact, might get us to do something initially, but it's not usually very lasting. Results in compassion fatigue and burnout, and really then just starting to become indifferent. Keller instead offers this. He says, the Bible gives believers two basic motivations: joyful awe before the goodness of God's creation and the experience of God's grace in redemption. That first one, talking about joyful awe in the face of God's creation, he's specifically talking about people. People that God has created uniquely, each and every one of them. People created in his image, meaning that we as people have this unique capacity to reflect the very character of God. It means that we're made like children to reflect their parents. We're made to reflect God to one another. It also means we're made for a unique relationship with God. And that's every single person, the good and the not so good, are made in the image of God. And because of that, God uniquely values each and every one. I was particularly struck by the example Keller used from Nicholas Wolterstorff to really drive this point home. Wolterstorff imagines a foreigner coming to America who really didn't know American history and coming upon the Mount Vernon estate. He thinks about how confused they might be at why it is a national monument. Why do we value this particular object so highly? In reality, Mount Vernon is just one of many old Virginia plantation houses, and actually many of the others have greater architectural merit and beauty. Yet he anticipates the response of most Americans who would address this confusion by saying the merits of the building itself are really irrelevant. It belonged to the founder of our country, and because we treasure the owner, we honor the house. What an amazing thought. That's just about a building. But God, the owner and creator of all things, he values every person. And if we value God, then we'll value what God values. And he will never value a person any less. Even when we turn away in rebellion and sin, God still values every creation, every person. He still loves every person. And if he loves us in our rebellion, then we too can love and value those even in their own rebellion. Keller goes on to talk about the second motivation that will sustain us in doing justice. That's the experience of God's redemption. I love and hate maybe how he compares the middle class in spirit with the poor in spirit. The poor in spirit are those who acknowledge and recognize that they are spiritually, morally bankrupt, that they have nothing to offer God that can increase their standing, that can make God owe them anything or respond in any positive way. There's nothing that we can do to coerce God. The middle class in spirit, Keller says, are those who feel that they have a certain standing with God, as if something about their lives merits God's attention or God's responsiveness. Most of the time, we don't say this out loud, but if we really think about it, if I really consider the state of my own heart, there are lots of times when I am middle class in spirit. There's times when I want to have standing before God, where I want to feel proud of myself as if I'm good enough, I'm worthy enough, and I have something that demands God to affirm me and give me attention. I think this middle class tendency is one that says, I want to be able to work hard and then be able to see the rewards of my work. I don't want to have to acknowledge that the works of my hands offer nothing of value to God. I don't want to need his grace. I don't want to acknowledge my own spiritual and moral bankruptcy. I want to believe that I am a good person and that I've worked hard to be so. And, well, the problem is that when I feel like I've worked so hard, I'm going to start comparing myself to other people and evaluating from my perspective, well, how hard have they worked? I have an image of myself that I want to maintain, that my hard work has gotten me ahead. And when I look and compare myself to others, I see maybe they're not working as hard. They're not as deserving. As those middle class in spirit, we can become so focused on trying to prove that we're not poor, we're not vulnerable, that we become indifferent to the suffering and the plight of the others. We might do works that are good. We might do works of charity, helping those in need, but not as a work of justice, actually as part of my middle-class spirituality. To be able to say, look, this is how good I am. I'm helping those in need, but after I have gotten the credit for that in my own mind, I move on. It doesn't sustain the long haul of doing justice. That long, messy, costly work of doing justice, Keller argues, is really only going to happen and be sustained by those who are poor in spirit. The more we examine ourselves, the more we realize and embrace our poverty, the more we realize that before a perfect, holy, and beautiful God, we have nothing of value to offer, the more we realize that all I bring to God is my debt and my need, the more I'll be able to look at others and see them as no different than me. those in need. And the more we realize that Jesus didn't look at us as those who were unworthy of his time, of his effort, his attention, but the more we realize that Jesus entered in, took on our poverty, took on our debt, took on our unworthiness to raise us up, man, then we can be inspired with energy and passion to see the others that are just like us in need and move toward them and lift them up as well. Meditate deeply. This is the invitation from this passage to me and to you, is to look at our hearts for real, to be honest and serious, embrace our poverty so that we can also be in awe and wonder at the grace of the God who would love us so much. So then we too will go and seek justice for others.